Hey, it's Alan. I get asked all the time, how exactly does Kadima help people? There are three primary ways. One, we provide one-on-one personalized career coaching with a focus on getting you a great job. Two, we provide an online do-it-yourself course where you can work at your own pace. Three, if you have a job offer, we'll help you negotiate for more. So to find out about these great services and everything else that we offer at Kadima, sign up for our newsletter. Go to syckpodcast.com. That's SYCK podcast.com. I promise you, it'll be the best newsletter to accelerate your career. Thanks a lot.
Live from Brooklyn, welcome to the Sick Career Podcast, starring Alan Stein, where he steers your career with Kadima. Along with Alan, I'm Russ Reba, and today's guest, Nayla, is an amazing coach. Alan has known her since 2005. She co-hosts a podcast called The Inside Job and has a healthy work obsession. A healthy obsession. I like that, which you will hear about. Alan, you realize you've known her since before your twins were born?
That's a long damn time. I think I actually knew her since 2004 when I began my MBA. But whether it's 2004, 2005, doesn't matter. 18, 19 years. I've been very fortunate to have Nayla in my circle and my network.
All right. Well, with that said, let's get into this Sick Career Podcast with Nayla.
I'm super excited to have Nayla Bahri here on the Steer Your Career with Kadima podcast. I first met Nayla during my time at Columbia Business School while I was spending $138,000 on my MBA tuition. I think Nayla got hers for free because she was working there. So she, did you get your MBA or some other?
I don't have an MBA. Actually, it's really funny after how much time I've spent there. No, I have a master's in education. I have a doctorate in education.
Got it. But you probably paid a lot less because you were working there. And then
one of the secret strategies. Yeah, sure.
Yeah. But Nayla was a dean of students, and I remember popping into her office often, and she was just always really helpful and supportive with whatever the students needed. I don't think I relied on her as much as I did the Career Center because I was maniacally focused on my career. Yeah. But Nayla was always there and an amazing partner. And since she has become a coach, and we'll talk a little bit about what she's done since 2005 when I met her. But with that, I'm going to hand it off to Nayla and just have you introduce yourself to the sick crowd here.
Oh my goodness. All right. Well, it's so nice to be with you today, Alan. Thank you for having me. It's hard for me to believe that we met in 2005 because I would have just been coming back from having my first child, and she is about to turn 18. So that's where the time goes.
I think I recall you being on mat leave for some of that. I was there 2004 to 2005.
Yeah, she was born halfway through 2004. So yeah, I mean, sometimes I time my periods of time at Columbia based on the birth of my two daughters. So how do I introduce myself? I generally say that I'm a person who's obsessed with how we relate to work. I am somebody who comes at this core question of how can we construct and live through a healthier relationship with work through a number of activities that I do. So I teach in the classroom. I teach at Columbia, at the School of Public Health primarily these days, although still at the business school from time to time. I do a lot of coaching, and I coach people privately. I coach people within organizations. I do group coaching. So I do a lot of work with leaders in organizations. I co-host a podcast called The Inside Job with my friend and colleague, Eric Johnson. And all of my work is really about figuring out how we want to relate to work, who we want to be in work, how to grow into our careers, and how to lead in a way that feels like. And so that's how I think about the work. I say, like, I am helping people do their greatest work, whatever that looks like. That's what I want to do.
Nice. And so you coach mostly professionals, I'm assuming, or?
Yeah, listen, I spent a lot of my career working with people in their, whatever age you might have been when you did your MBA. So they were in their mid-20s or something, had 2, 3, 4 years of experience. Now I find myself working primarily with people who have my level of experience. So I've been in the marketplace 20, 30. So yeah, I'm working with professionals at all stages of life, though I have to say, though, some earlier in career, mostly deeper into career, but always curious about what can be different. And sometimes that curiosity comes from the inside. They're just ready for something else. And sometimes it comes from the outside, right? They're either getting tough feedback that they're not growing the way they want to in their roles, or that they have some corrections to make to behaviors that may have served them earlier in their lives. some kind of disruption has happened, like they've been laid off or reorganized and they're not happy where things ended up. So whatever that trigger is, whether it's internal, like it's time for a change, or it's something from the outside, I want to be there to help them figure it out.
Yeah. And in your LinkedIn profile, you say you have background and experience working with people who've been laid off, job displacement, simply bad work that impacted their confidence, productivity, and career plan. So talk to me about so this stuff can occur for a variety of different reasons, like business related, family related, burned out, other things like that. When they come to you, do they have an idea of where they want to go? Or is it just often more, I don't like where I'm at now?
I can tell you, I see like the range, right? Everything from, to your point, like the reasons people might end up working with me might be that sometimes I say it like this, like work broke up with them. Like work decided like it's time for this to come to an end. And that might be because of a layoff. It might be because of performance. It might be because they've been marginalized slowly, like the slow leak that happens when we're kind of put aside. Sometimes it's because there is like my family's relocating and I have to start over, or I've just kind of maxed out on this particular role in this particular organization. Do they come with clarity? I mean, ultimately, what I often say is that I don't do what I call like the last mile of coaching. If you know exactly the kind of organization you want to apply for and you just need help getting your resume up to date, nailing that interview, I know a lot of great people, you included, who do that work, and I would love to refer them. I'm more interested in the kind of work where there's questions on people's minds and hearts about where they fit. Yeah. And I'm especially interested when people are looking at their careers and they're saying, I've put in 15 or 20 years and I don't want to lose that, air quotes, but I don't want to necessarily go in the same path. I want to try to see what else is out there. And I feel like I'm at a crossroad and I don't have a map. And, I think that is the place where and that's true for career. It's true for leadership. Like the thing that I've been doing to motivate my team and to galvanize the people who report to me worked, and then it stopped working, or we're facing a mountain I don't know how to scale. So it's that place where you're at a crossroad of sorts and feeling a little bit alone that I usually come in.
How do you help people identify their North Star or where they're trying to go to? So, because a big part of what I focus on, I use a growth framework, and the G is goals. So identify those goals, and I push people to identify companies that will meet those goals. But how do you approach it? And like, I think it sounds as if it's important to align with them and to think through their goals before they start heading down that path. Am I correct in understanding that?
Yeah, I might even take a step before that, Alan, and say, like, the thing I really think about is, the core question, this is the question that I think is on so many minds and hearts of the people who come to me, is what do I want? Right? To be able to answer what kind of company I want to look at or the precise company I want to target is later in the process, in my view. What I'm usually working with people is like, something's not quite right. There's an ache. There's a sense that I'm not doing exactly what I'm destined to be doing, or I'm not what I'm doing at this stage in my career, but I don't know how to begin. So, that first question, what do I want? I liken it to a bit of an excavation. It's like a site. We are dusting away the debris of everything I'm supposed to want, everything I've done to this moment, what my parents think, what my boss thinks, what the business school told me was the next best step for me. We're brushing all of that away to look at the core to what you want and need from work at this point in your life. One of the core ideas I bring to my work is that changes. There's an evolution that happens for us as we mature as humans, and also with other roles in our lives, right? First of all, our families might change. We become parents, we become partners. We have to start taking care of our parents. Like, lots of things can change in our lives, but also circumstances change. Just look at the time I hope we're exiting, the transitioning out of, right? Like, people's lives have been changed by the COVID experience, by the pandemic, and all the other accompanying factors that have shifted in the last 2 years. So I'm interested in helping people take an accurate snapshot of what they want now, acknowledging that some things may be the same as 10 years ago, some things may be quite different, in order for them to then head towards, the question you're asking, which is like, help me identify the companies that might be able to give me what I want. I'm doing the precursing work, which is like, what do you need from work right now? What do you want from work right now? How does that fit into what you want from your broader life? Whether that's your health, whether that's your family, whether that's financial, whether that's hobbies and community life. What are you ready to leave behind? What are you ready to try that's new in terms of experiences or skills or people. And so that really requires like the people who I do the best work with have that appetite. They're really willing, because it's not straightforward. They're willing to kind of sit in the mess of that site and like find a clue here, a hint here, a piece of gold there, and try to weave together a prospect of what the future could hold. There are a lot of people who don't ever have that moment of questioning. It must be said. There are some people who, for, a 35 or 40 year career, there's a path. It's pretty straight. They have a sense of what they want early. It doesn't deviate very much over time. And I think those people are fortunate. I wish them well. They probably don't need to talk to me. The people who need to talk to me they're entering a fog of sorts, and they're trying to get out of the fog.
What are some of those questions you ask, or some ways that you help them see through that fog?
I love that.
Because I find it's often easier for people to say what they don't like about their current situation. Sometimes they might have been displaced or something like that. And it's harder to identify what they want to see beyond that fog.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things I'll ask all of my clients to do, and, I would ask anyone listening to this to do, is to do a bit of a look backwards over like a timeline. I sometimes say like 10 years or so. And, in simplest terms, you draw a line across the horizon of a piece of paper, and you plot above it the times that you call your peak moments that have been full of fulfillment, reward. You felt great. You felt seen. You felt like you were learning. The results were good. And then below the line, start looking at what I would call a bleak moment. Things are just not there, right? Either you're not being compensated or rewarded well. You drag your feet into the day. There's resentment. It just doesn't feel good. And start looking for patterns in there. That's one of the things we do, is just kind of look backwards and figure out, what have I already learned about myself? And sometimes I think we don't take the long view when we look backwards. We kind of think of like, I just got out of something bad, so now it's over, it's done. But I'm looking for a more long-term view and insight. That's one thing I'll have people do. And the other thing I'll have people do is, a set of questions that we'll explore, sometimes together in session, sometimes in work they do outside of session. And I say, what is work worth doing for you? And I use the language of desire around work. Like, I think it's important to get kind of guttural and visceral around it. Like, what do you really want? Like, what makes you feel like I could do this all day? What is the thing you see other people have that you feel kind of jealous or envious about? What are the things when you allow yourself to dream that you imagine doing with your time? Who are you collaborating with? Where are you working? I want our work together to feel that imaginative and that large. We'll start to whittle it down and create options and real pathways and research. But I like to spend time with people in that dreamy state where they can really tune in to what their desires are. That's how I begin. And I think, and sometimes it ends up looking like a series of Post-it notes or a bunch of journal entries. And part of our work is to sew together a narrative that makes sense of all those notes and ideas and imaginations and visions into something that's viable.
That's some real sick advice there that you had about, like, I told you it was going to come out. So you sit down with them and have them take almost an inventory of their peak. I think you called it peak and bleak.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And what are some of those things that you often see? Like, do you see common patterns of what shows up on people's peak list and some things that are common on bleak, or it's individual?
I think it's as individual as the people who I do work with. Right. But I think what sometimes is difficult is that what signifies or qualifies as someone's peak might not be what they thought they were supposed to want. And that becomes something worth unpacking. Right. So it might be that I have a pattern where someone said, you know what? And I went through this with a client recently who she did her peak moments. And she's like, really, what I find is that I'm happiest when I'm working independently. Like, when I have a high degree of autonomy, I'm kind of left to my own devices. I can put some headphones on and put my head down and just do the work. I'm actually the happiest. But I tell myself that in order to grow my career, I have to have a large team. I have to be in a very collaborative environment. Those are the companies that are growing fast. That's the work everybody wants. But if I'm honest with myself and if there's like a handful of core principles in my work, it's like, let's be honest with ourselves at the minimum. It's not what I want. I don't want to be in that kind of team-oriented environment. I'm really more of an individual contributor. I will say, I've seen this a number of times where people have the belief they're only supposed to go upwards through management, only supposed to go upwards through leading enormous teams and huge projects and like having 100, 200, 300 people report to them. And some people really do their best work on their own. That's what I think the peak and bleak moment can help you uncover. Like, the truth is, if I ask myself, when did I feel amazing about work? When did I have that experience of satisfaction and flow? It will reveal itself to you if you've answered it honestly. And then we have to be okay with what we find.
And that's an interesting point. You have the IC, the individual contributor route versus the manager route. There seems to be a natural pull or expectation for people that as you go up with an organization, you need to start leading people.
Yeah.
A lot of the
I'm not sure how natural pull is. I think that pull comes from business school, from the way we perceive organizations. I think what I'm hoping is that the peak and bleak moment will reveal to you what your natural pull is. And then you'll figure out how close it is to what expectations from the outside might be.
That's true. It may not be natural. It's almost like expectation. So like when they look at senior leaders, they're leading big people, like big teams of individuals. In the tech world, and this was kind of new to me when I moved from Amex to Google, is people can go up several levels, very high seniority as an individual contributor versus a manager. Although I still saw that pressure for individuals to manage. And there are frankly a lot of people that enjoy management, but there's a lot of people that don't. And whether they do or don't, they're just poor at it. Michael Jordan was one of the best basketball players ever to play in the NBA. And he was a shitty coach and a shitty general manager.
Yeah.
So just because you can play the game doesn't mean that you can lead the game.
It's so funny that you say that, because this morning on LinkedIn, a good friend of mine who runs an app called Daily Aloha, which I love, she asked the way the app is built is to ask kind of thought-provoking questions that are designed to produce empathy and understanding in other people. And the question was like, what do you feel shame about at work? And she had kind of invited me to chime in on something on LinkedIn. And I said, and I said something different, but I noticed someone else posted the shame that like, I don't want to lead people. Because I think this is one of the big messages that, and it's funny, who helped me uncover this for myself was my mother. And I've talked about this on our podcast also, is that my mom's an engineer by training. And as she proceeded through her career, she would turn down the opportunities to manage people. And she would say, I like the science. I like to do the work. And plus, she always worked part-time until we were out of elementary school. She's like, I want to be able to go at 2 and get my kids. If you put me in charge of people, first, I don't think I'm a great manager. Second, I'll find myself doing less of the work where I really excel. And third, it's going to interfere with what I really need outside of work. And I thought, at the time, I was like, Mom, you cut yourself short. Like, what about women in leadership? But it turns out like she was teaching me very early to know who you are and to honor who you are and to not wear a mask and pretend that something that's not for you is actually for you.
Yeah. The deep thoughts by Nayla's mom.
Thanks, Mom.
As you go through this exercise with people and they start to identify what they enjoy doing, what's at their peak, then I guess the next step is potentially how do they achieve that sort of peak or like...
Yeah, a little bit like that. Yeah, the way I think about, again, I like to spend a fair amount of time in the what you want part of this.
Yeah.
If I'm doing like career change or what do I, building your healthier relationship with work stuff. So once we start building some vocabulary, some language, and listen, there's a lot of stuff that happens for us individually. Some of it is like we start to tell ourselves we're demanding too much. It's not reasonable. That stuff doesn't exist. Who am I to say, we have to kind of manage all the internal monsters who show up and tell you your needs are wrong, right? Because there's a lot of that messaging that's like, you don't want the right things. You should want onwards and upwards. You should want bigger, more glory, all those things. Once we can kind of name what we want and we can get okay with what we want, there's a process I want to put people through, which is to kind of integrate the desire with the narrative they have of where they're coming from. So how does it start to build a storyline that's anchored in your real experience? What have you done already? What have you already won? Done really well with? What have you learned along the way? And then how does this set you up for the exploration of what could come next? So the 3 core questions I think about in this kind of work are, what do I want? Where am I coming from? What's next? So if we've answered what I want, where am I coming from is like, how do I build a story that I believe in, that I'm not apologizing for, but that actually presents the real me in a way that makes it likely that someone will say, yeah, I want to keep talking to you about this. I'm interested in this, right? So we do spend some time, answering the, how awesome are you question, that middle question. Where are you coming from? And then we go into what's next. And I use the process I use to figure out what could be next. I call it designing personal research questions. And it's basically saying, now that you have a hunch of what you want, and you know how it fits into the narrative of where you're coming from and what you're curious about exploring, how can you get some more data? How can you figure out who has jobs like that? Who's doing that kind of work? How other people may have made a transition from what the industry you come from to the industry you're curious about? How do you identify those companies? To your point, Alan, it's like I send people out to do research, to design really good research questions and to get data. And sometimes that data comes from Googling and being on the internet and finding job postings, learning about companies, watching things on YouTube. Sometimes, a lot of the time, it comes from talking to people, being like really intentional with your networking so that you're finding out how you made a move from Amex into Google in your case, or how I made a move to go from 20 years in higher education to going to work in corporate learning and development. So I send people out, let's go hunting for data. Let's go do some research. And that's how we kind of, I think ultimately there's like the handoff between someone who does what I do and someone who does more like what maybe you do or other coaches do, where you're saying, okay, now that you've targeted the handful of companies that are your dream companies, how do we get you to the right conversations with the right people?
Yeah. And I like how you break that down. You say, like, what do I want? Where am I coming from? And what's next? And I'm guessing a lot of people that you're dealing with, there's a disconnect there, because if what they wanted was what they're doing now, they're probably not coming to you for a change.
Oh, right.
And if there's a disconnect between what they want and where they're coming from, the resume itself is not going to be able to tell that story. So it's more them communicating that. And it sounds like a big portion of this is them going out and talking to people.
Yeah, it's like, Bill, to me, there's always a story that can be told if we're willing to experiment with it, right? So the connection between what you want and where you're coming from is yours to tell, right? And sometimes it's like, I'm making a radical change because my life has shifted, or because my interests have shifted, or because I'm growing as a person. And therefore, 20 years of this kind of history is turned into a desire for something else. But my guess, especially because we work with this very modular approach, the excavating at the site and finding the pieces of gold and little moments in our history, we can start to see parallels between what it is that we want and need from work, what our peaks have been and what the future might hold. And sometimes the ingredients, like I say, sometimes I'll use the expression also, or the metaphor of using like your kitchen cabinet, like go to the core ingredients, the salt and the pepper, the cinnamon. Like at the core, there was some cinnamon in your old job, and you got to figure out how to use cinnamon in your new job. But that's our story to tell. And I think where some of us get tripped up is like we look at a job that we hold and the responsibilities, and a job that we aspire to and the responsibilities, and we're taking everything at face value and not probing a little bit beneath it. What are the real problems and the real opportunities people are solving in that work? And how does what you already know how to do show up in that context? That is, I think, where a coach can be really helpful, because it's like we're storytelling, we're excavating, and we're building a story that's grounded in reality, but it's a different take on a tale as old as time, right? We're just figuring out another way to share the story to make it compelling to the person on the other end of that conversation. And I think that's one of the things that, people who are, I've been called a creative coach in the past. And I think it's one of the ways in which I'm creative. It's like I hear what people have to say, and I sometimes find the meaning beneath the words. And I think that comes from having been a nerd my whole life, an avid book reader, literature major, all those things that had me really interested in human story way before I understood adult development theory or coaching.
Yeah. So you mentioned a couple of ways that people can do this excavation. One, you said like Googling it, checking on the internet, talking to you, trained professional, but a lot of this is also in conversations that they're having with others.
Yes. I mean, this is the thing. Like, it's funny. Maybe it's because I grew up, so to speak, in a business school. I spent most of my, 20s and 30s and part of my 40s working for a business school. The idea of networking is so natural for me. The idea of just talking to people openly and with a lot of interest in what they do, what I'm interested in, it's very natural for me. And yet I desperately understand that some people, it just triggers all the stuff. It makes them feel sweaty and gross and paranoid and sleazy. And I have no judgment around that. But part of the work I do is help people like rewrite the story of what talking to people is really about. Yeah. And helping people think about this as relationships and as learning. And honestly, this came from some of the research I did around layoff, because I think what I saw quite frequently is that people who had been laid off felt an aversion to networking, because it felt like I don't have anything to offer right now. It feels very much like I'm taking because I don't have a job. So therefore, this doesn't, if I have this notion in my mind that networking is an exchange, and even exchange in real time, then I'm going to tell you what's going on at Google and you can tell me what's going on at Amex. That doesn't help if I don't have something right now. So I would see people get tripped up by this during the layoff period. And one of the patterns of behavior that I saw that allowed people to move beyond this into kind of thriving, where they really reframed their understanding of networking. And they started thinking of it as learning conversations. And sometimes I'm doing learning about myself. I'm not just learning about industry or company, but I'm making myself the material to understand what maybe I could have done differently, but not even because I think we have agency over layoffs, but because sometimes we don't see signs that are coming. Because sometimes when we're happy at work, we underestimate the power of having a good narrative, of having a strong networking habit. And because sometimes we're in the business of figuring out if the thing that is available works for me now, and so a lot of the networking conversations are about listening to someone's experience and then reconciling it with our own needs and saying like, they're really excited about that job. Because I'm really excited about that job. So I think pivoting our point of view on what networking is about, it's not about transactions, it's about relationships and learning, softens some of the grossness of it. But I think it's probably like, if I send people out for data, it's the primary activity, like more than anything, you're talking to people. Yeah, you're doing your research at home. Yeah, you're running some experiments. I call it making work. But really the bulk of your time is engaging with people who can tell you something you don't already know.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of that, either forging new relationships or re-engaging loose or weak ties that you haven't spoken to in a while are equally valuable. When you are working with clients or talking to people that are hesitant to reach out and might spend too much time Googling or just surfing LinkedIn or doing tasks.
Making more Excel work spreadsheets about people they know but aren't talking to.
Yeah, exactly. Which I've been a victim of myself. How do you help encourage them to change their behavior? And because I've been a very heavy networker throughout my career, and it's always been very beneficial to me. I never had any hesitancy with it outside, like when I was a kid, like when I was shy. But how do you get people to overcome that hesitancy or the sweaty palms or what have you?
Yeah. Well, there's a few things that come to mind. One of them is, I always say to my clients, imagine being on the receiving end of that phone call where someone's like, hey, I just want to talk to you about what you're doing right now. Like, frankly, most of us love to talk about ourselves. So if someone reaches out and says, hey, Nayla, I'm curious about your job, most of the time I feel boosted. I feel excited. I feel open. So I'll say to my clients, imagine being on the receiving end, because I think we forecast that people are going to be like, oh my God, that guy again, I'm so busy, I couldn't hardly. But the truth is most of us are flattered when someone comes to us. The other thing I'll say is let's do reps, let's practice, like we're playing a sport or doing something that we're learning how to do. So start with someone who's likely to say yes to you, someone who's already in your corner, someone who is a really warm tie, to use your language, someone who's just already rooting for you, like a good friend from college or business school or someone you used to work with whom you've had a lot of affection. Start where you'll win so that you build the confidence and the self-efficacy as you go. And you realize we're just two people who want to talk about work, and that's A-okay. I'll also say this is, I think, a great place for being in a group. If you're in a coaching group ever, is an opportunity, because then you realize everybody has a little bit, even those of us who like you and me, who are really love to network, because I just think of it as talking to people I really care about or I'm curious about. It still helps to realize everyone has stuff. Everyone has beliefs. Everyone has nerves. Everyone has doubts that their story is strong enough. And I think it's kind of humbling and also fortifying to be around other people who are going through the process, like a job seeker group or group coaching or whatever it is that you have available to you.
Yeah. When you're talking about networking, it's not about asking for a job often. It's about asking advice. And people that can't see your face, you're like, it was a clear no.
No.
The intent is not transactional. The intent is to foster and grow the relationship. And I think something that you said, I might be paraphrasing, is when you're seeking advice from people, when you're asking them to tell me about you, about your job, about what you do. People love talking about themselves. You've been talking this whole podcast about a lot of the stuff that you're doing. And the only thing stopping me from doing it is I'm the one asking you. But
it's so true. And forgive me for talking so much, but sometimes I just can't stop it when it's about this work. But I think that's not only do people love to talk about themselves, but one of the gifts, surprising gifts of being skilled at networking is that you help others make sense of their own experience. So just this week, it's funny. I have a client who is she has been working independently as a digital marketing strategist for some time. and she was laid off, and for like 2 years was freelancing. So she thought, and then suddenly has a business, and she's at that inflection point where she said, do I go back in house, try to find like a job in an organization, or do I grow this thing? We talk about what she wants. One of the things she says is, I want to grow this thing, but I'm apprehensive because I suspect other people are having an easier time. They know what they're doing. And I said, well, that sounds like a great research question. Like, do other small business owners have a plan, or how do they figure out what their plan is? So I sent her out to do research, talk to other business owners, and figure out how are they figuring out their plans versus what they're making up on the fly, versus how do they reconcile the apprehension, the nerves, the doubts that all of us have when we run our own business. She came back to me and said, would you be one of those people? I said, sure. So I ended up spending another half hour with her just doing that kind of exploration. And I realized as she was asking me questions, it was forcing me to reflect on a number of things I had done consciously and subconsciously, but I was learning about myself through that conversation, right? And this is one of the surprising gifts of networking, is like both people, especially if there's like real intention in the conversation and direction in the conversation, walk out wiser. The person who has the advice to give learn something too. So whenever people say like, I could never, like, what do I have to offer? I sometimes say, well, you're going to give them 30 minutes or 20 minutes where they get to reflect on their own choices and figure out something about how they got here that they may not have seen before.
Yeah, totally agreed. I get a lot out of conversation. Sometimes I get a good restaurant recommendation from somebody that I wasn't anticipating or something like that. So making a little bit of a deviation from our current conversation, you and I have chatted in the past about hustle and grit. Grit's a term that Angela Duckworth has made a little bit famous with, and I think she defines it as passion and purpose for something. It sometimes has a negative connotation. But what's your thought about hustle and grit and how that plays into people's career acceleration and their career path?
So there's like a lot of words I think we toss around the space, and you could argue about this in leadership development as well as for career planning, that there's like vocabulary that has become simplified to the point where it like shows up as like hashtags and t-shirts and coffee mugs. And I think I worry that words like hustle and grit are falling into that. So there's lots of things I appreciate about the idea of hustling and the idea about demonstrating or having or growing grit. And there's also things I see as like the oppression of those words. Like they feel like a albatross around our neck rather than an inspiration that we're moving towards. And that's something I think about a lot when I'm helping people unpack the shoulds around work, right? So I have a lot of people I work with. Listen, to be fair, many of the people who come to my door are MBAs, either ones I worked with directly when they were at Columbia or people like them, right? Went to top schools and are on that path where they believe life is measured through a particular definition of professional success, that we should always want more. We should always want bigger and better. The goal is CEO or something like that. I must have, to our conversation a few minutes ago, 300, 400 people reporting to me, massive products I'm launching, must have a P&L. Like that is the way to measure progress. Where I get suspicious around hustle and grit is when we start saying, I should hustle harder or have more grit because I don't see myself getting there. And the root of why I'm not getting there is because there's a misalignment with what I really want. I'm playing by someone else's rule book. I'm following someone else's North Star, to use your example from before. I think that's where I start coming up against the edge of those words. Because I think if we're in pursuit of something that really means something to us, and it's a pathway that has obstacles, that has difficulty, that has challenges where time is going to work against us, and we must have the tenacity to move forward, then I'm all for hustle and grit. When it feels like we're wearing someone else's clothes, I'm going to put a big halt on that conversation. And I see too many people that you and I know who are chasing someone else's North Star. They're wearing someone else's clothes. No good. And I think that the problem is that hustle and grit can be used against them in that language. They hear, well, I'm not hustling enough. If it's not happening, it's because I'm not hustling enough. When in fact, it just might be like, you're hiking the wrong trail. It's not your trail.
Yeah. It's an interesting perspective, because when I hear grit and I hear thinking about passion and perseverance, passion in my mind is something that comes natural. It's hard to develop passion for something that's not yours. But I think sometimes people chase passions that are defined from them from exterior perspectives, maybe chasing titles, maybe chasing number of people that they're they're managing or things of that nature. How do you see, and like this is probably a personal question, but people are coming to you because they're chasing something. Maybe their definition is success. How do you see people often define success versus what maybe they should be thinking of success as? Is there a disconnect of where, like when they're coming to you, what they think success is versus like, not that there's a right answer for success, but are they defining success in a way that's leading them down a different path?
Yeah. I mean, I think what you're opening for me are more questions than answers. I think that's exactly right. Like what generally, if you end up at my doorstep, you've got that sense that something's off. And what we're trying to figure out is exactly what you said. Like, what do you need to feel? And even the word success, I'm going to have a little bit of umbrage with, as you can imagine. Yeah. What do you need to feel like yourself? What do you need to feel satisfied, to have meaning? Like the word I'm always after is meaning, like it means something to you. And there's lots of tools we can use to help you figure that out. You know, we've talked about some of them, like other coaching tools would be like the Wheel of Life, helping you look at your whole life to figure out what it is that you need now to have meaning in your life. This is, again, I think it feels personal because I think I too am very subject, like anyone who has been a classic overachiever and who has met a lot of the markers of traditional success, right? Like brand name schools and titles and the job that people are like, ooh, that's so cool. Like that stuff starts to be very confused with success. Like I've made it, I've done something. And there's so much unlearning that has to happen so that we can rewrite a script that's right for us. That's the heart of the work. It's like, what is it? What even when you say success, what does that mean? For some people, it's cash. It's like, I can put my kids through college. I can retire. I have savings. For some people, success is like my voice is in the world. I share the thing that I think about in the world. Success is like I shape someone else's career, or I teach and I share what I know. But if we're not careful, whether it's grit or hustle or success, if we're not careful about defining what words mean for us, we're going to use a readily available definition that we got off a coffee cup. Like, God help us if that's what we're getting, or guidance. But, it's a shorthand. I get it. But I want to stop and poke around a little bit.
So if success is a difficult term, quantify and define, what do you generally recommend people head towards? Because they're coming to you in this fog.
Yeah.
And they're trying to identify peaks and areas that will have more of those peaks than those bleaks. How do you what, if you don't want to call it success, what do you call it when you're trying to get somebody out of, they're unhappy when they're coming to you. If they're perfectly happy, perfectly satisfied, they're probably not paying you for coaching, not initially. Anyway, they may continue with you, but what do you call that then? If it's not success,
I think you can call it whatever you want to call it. For me, I'm looking for a life of meaning, a career of meaning. Meaning is the word I use. And I'll say to people too, I want work or a life that delights you. I want a life or work that feels like you, that reflects you, that allows you to express yourself in the world. And that's why I use this very modular approach. I'm not afraid of a list. What does a great life look like? It includes these things. And then there's courage implicit in that, and there's risk implicit in that. And there is grit. Once we find what is ours, or we remember what is ours, then it takes tenacity, and it takes being aligned with our purpose and our calling, and facing the naysayers and going after what we want. And again, I'm not advocating that everyone live in a van and move to Utah and sell bracelets or, these things you see on Instagram. Many people we know have hit that definition of success or meaning, whatever you want to call it. And they're working at Facebook or at Google or at Mount Sinai or wherever they're working. I don't think it's the end game is not really as interesting to me as the integrity of the decision that you've made. It's truly an integrity with you. But that's how I think about it. Is we got to find language and a true north that sounds like you and looks like you. And then we have to move courageously in the direction of that.
Yeah. It's a very personal decision of what that is. Once you progress to a point where you get your client or the individual to kind of identify what they're looking for, how do you help them get there? What advice do you have?
Call people like you.
Yeah.
What do I help? I mean, I think, one of the things that really characterizes my work is like, I want to spend time in this like dream state, right? Like it's kind of figuring things out, but then we also have to have jobs. Like we have to move forward. Most of us need to work to help support our families. And so that's why I like the idea of the research questions. It moves people into action. Some of the work that we do as coaches, as is helping people stay on track, set goals that are achievable, that have a little bit of a stretch in them that you're going to get done. Have the conversations, meet with the people, refine your thinking as you go. Create your materials, whatever your assets are, your resume, your CV, your LinkedIn profile, get it out there, start bidding for work, putting your application in for jobs. And I think the pre-work really matters. I never want to see people just kind of come to me and be like, I got laid off. I need a new resume so I can get out there. Like, I'm not your coach. But we also I don't want to spend too much time navel gazing. I think there's a blend of reflection and action that's characteristic of how adults learn, but it's also characteristics of moving us forward. And the people who come to people like us, Alan, need to move forward. They want to move forward. So there's also like a lot of experimentation in trying and getting out there. That's part of the work that we do. And then again, when it gets very technical for that last mile, I will refer people to a resume coach or to a LinkedIn coach because there's excellent people out there. But we have to commit to taking action. And that's a lot of what a coach can help you do.
And I actually, especially in some of the situations you're talking about, I don't think it's the resume and the LinkedIn coach necessarily. I think it's more building those relationships, fostering those relationships, trying to convey your story, kind of like what you do, of where you were can apply to where they want to go and leverage those strengths. There has to be something there. So if you're going from like a marketer at like Mars and you're marketing chocolate bars and you want to instead do something better for the world and you want to maybe market Noom, like the device that helps people with their weight loss, you're still trying to sell something to the consumer, but you need to convey that to human beings, because if they see that you're a marketer at Mars, they're like, well, that's the exact opposite of what Noom is trying to do.
Yeah. I mean, there is some work to be done in the story there, but I don't think it's impossible work at all.
Yeah. So we're finishing up the podcast here. I have a couple of last questions for you.
Sure.
Where can people follow you? Like, I know I listen to your podcast, but
thank you.
Great time for you to plug your podcast, where they can find you there and how else they can reach out to you.
Eric Johnson and I co-host a podcast called The Inside Job. We're available wherever you listen to podcasts. We focus on the intersection of life and work. And we really take the premise that our satisfaction, the meaning that we want from work, starts in the inside, from knowing ourselves, understanding ourselves, and honoring ourselves so that we can take great action in the world. We'd love for you guys to tune in. I'm very active on LinkedIn, so it's a great place to find me. And my website is my name, Nayla Bahri, NAYLABAHRI.com.
And I love your podcast that you guys do. I just listened to one I was telling you before, where you guys were talking about not just career changes, but also talking about the Golden Girls and mullets, both things that I was big fans of in the 80s.
I was surprised to hear about the latter, Alan. I'm not going
to. And I actually think it's really interesting, your approach that you take there and your approach that you take in your practice. You put a very heavy focus on the goals and like identifying where people want to go to. And I think once you invest all that time and effort, it's probably easier to have that hustle and to have that perseverance, because you invested some time and research in identifying where you're headed to.
Yeah. You're using the energy in the appropriate direction. I think where we meet resistance, we find ourselves I'm sure you find times where clients are spinning their wheels, or they're just, I meant to, but I didn't get around to it. And sometimes I'm like, are you sure we're chasing the right thing? Because if it ignites that spark that this thing is mine to have, I see a lot of momentum. But when we are chasing someone else's dream, we stall, we stumble, we stop for a snack. I mean, there's lots of things we do to stop ourselves from being in pursuit of something that's not ours to chase anyway.
Yep. And besides stopping for snacks, which is not the best thing to do, what is your last piece of sick advice that you would leave the steer your career with that can help them move forward, accelerate their career, and achieve some of their goals?
Yeah. You know what I would say is don't be disappointed in yourself if you're not settling. And by that, I mean, sometimes I hear my clients say, I should be grateful for what I have. Or I don't know why I'm making this so hard on myself by launching a search when I have a perfectly fine job. And I guess the advice here is listen to yourself, your soul, your spirit, whatever you believe is, that kind of deep knowing that's not super brain powered, but like more whole powered, is not going to steer you wrong. If it's calling for your attention, pay attention to it and honor it. Work really matters. The thing I always say is that we spend 90,000 hours of our lives working, and to pretend that we can do that when we're climbing someone else's mountain or we're wearing someone else's clothes, like that seems to me like a waste of a life. So if your soul is calling for you to pay attention, pay attention. Let's do something about it.
Listen to your soul.
Amen.
Okay. Well, Nayla, I appreciate this. I appreciated reinvigorating our relationship from Colombia. And that was a good example of rekindling loose ties, which I'm a huge fan of.
Awesome. This has been a pleasure. Thank you so much. And I wish you all the best with this podcast.
Thanks a lot, Nayla.
Listen to your soul. Exceptional advice. Nayla, thanks so much for your insight and your conversation with Alan today. All right, so for everybody listening, be sure to connect with Alan at sickpodcast.com. That's SYCK. Browse the blog to get some really cool information. You can sign up for the newsletter. Alan, your parting words before we hang up the headphones for the day?
The job market's getting a little tighter. There's still lots of great jobs out there, but this is just more important for you to take ownership of your career, to steer your career, and go seize those opportunities and accelerate your career.
All right, there you go. For Alan Stein, I'm Russ Reba. We hope you've enjoyed this Sick Career Podcast episode with Nayla, and you're going to love the next one.